Okay, everybody, I think we're going to get started. Thanks for coming out on this beautiful spring Saturday. My name is Jordan House. I'm a member of the Socialist Project, one of the co-organizers of the event tonight. I'm part of what we are calling the Higher Education Labor Working Group of the Socialist Project, who has been working on issues around higher education labor, as the name implies, for the last few months. I'm going to be emceeing tonight. I'll give you a brief rundown of what we're doing. I'll say a few introductory remarks just about why we are putting this event on. First I'll introduce the rest of the panel. Okay, so yeah, in addition to myself, I'll just go down the list with our panelists. First we've got Bryan Evans, a professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Toronto Metropolitan University. Next to him is Niko Block, a PhD student in political science at York University, whose writing has appeared in Jacobin, Social Text, Palestine Monitor, Canadian Dimension, and Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Next to him is Nithiananthan, a community organizer on working class neighborhood and labor issues. And then to my right is Maddy Lee, a U of T undergraduate student and organizer with Ontario Students Against Austerity. So we're calling this event Education Under Siege. And I think for those of you who are in the higher education sector, as workers or students, or just concerned community members, many of the problems in the sector should be apparent and obvious to you. I'm not sure that I have to say too much about them. There's the obvious issue of chronic underfunding and the austerity regime, things that Bryan's going to talk more about in a minute. We've also seen a push towards marketization, privatization, especially in terms of what's going on with the colleges and OSAP reforms. Maddy is going to speak to some of these things. And then there are issues of creeping authoritarianism, increased government meddling, reduced institutional autonomy, and then the obvious dire issues around free speech, freedom of assembly, and academic freedom, especially as they relate to solidarity with Palestinians. But the sector is also remarkable for the amount of resistance that we've seen. An incredible amount of strike activity by staff and faculty at higher education institutions, student and community mobilizations. However, these fightbacks have thus far been very siloed. And part of what we in the Socialist Project and this higher education working group have come together to try to do is to encourage more solidarity and coordination across the sector and a broader kind of sectoral approach. Rather than having these fights institution by institution, we need to build a movement which is capable of fighting not only our bosses and administrators, but the big boss, which is the conservative government. And so, to this end, we have held a series of meetings since the fall, bringing together workers from across universities and colleges to talk about what we could do to build such a movement. A lot of our organizing has centered around what we are calling a solidarity pact, which the idea would be a series of joint principles that unions in the sector could adopt to encourage this kind of thing. Things like common bargaining tables, bargaining for the common good, better coordination around things like resisting back-to-work legislation or other meddling in collective bargaining processes. And so this is very much a work in progress. Thus far, what I think we have accomplished is starting to build up a network of like-minded activists. And this is partially reflected by who's in the room. We're very happy to have Ontario Students Against Austerity tabling here tonight. Maddy's going to speak to their campaign, but very much encourage you to talk to them after the event as well. And so I guess with that said, I'll turn things over to Bryan. Everybody's going to speak for about 10 minutes, which should leave us some time for Q&A. Looking forward to discussion with everybody here today.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody, on a wonderful evening. So I'm going to begin with a bit of historical context, where I've been around for a long time, and I'm a product of that historical context. I grew up in Sudbury, very working class family. My dad was a miner, bartender. My mom worked as a grocery clerk at the A&P, Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, or whatever it was called back then. And I began my year one in 1979. Totally different era, where my tuition was $900. I could make my tuition in 6 weeks of not very good work. And the world changed later for many of the younger people here. So what I want to do is provide a little bit of context and slip into the granular detail of the strategy, if we can call it a strategy, of the foreign government. It's not really a strategy, it's very ad hoc, but I'll kind of touch upon that in a bit. But we have to remember, in the late 1950s, going into the 1970s, Ontario, like many places, embarked on a dramatic program of higher education expansion. The Ontario government, from 57 to 1973, 1957 to 1973, created 9 new universities in Ontario. In 1980, total enrollment, again, I'm not accounting for population growth, so bear that in mind, was about 150-odd thousand, compared to 580,000 today. So you have these dramatic increases in growth. I was hired at Ryerson, now TMU, 2002. We had a total of 14,000 students. Today, 45. It kind of tracks that general kind of growth in enrollment, which funding has not kept pace with. And the other critical part here, again, boring data, but it's not unimportant. Until about 1995, the provincial government of Ontario provided about 70 to 80%, depending on the year, it would waver up and down, of operating grants, annual operating grants, which allowed the universities to fund themselves. In 1996, the Common Sense Revolution, Premier Mike Harris, that incrementally began dropping, hitting about 50%. Today, anybody have an idea how much provincial operating grants account for total budget? Anybody have a guess? 30%. So, in my time, we've gone from 80% provincially funded, very affordable tuition, to 30%. And tuition which is increasingly problematic. Maybe not unaffordable, but it's increasingly becoming an issue. And the changes to OSAP that the foreign government brought in with the budget back a month or two ago are very revealing about this entire reconceptualization of the role of higher education. And I bring in that historical context only in terms of you have to remember or be aware that in that period of the late 50s, 1960s, 1970s, the height of the post-war, I hate the term golden age, it was not a golden age for everybody, but it's in terms of equality, it was the most equal time in economic terms that we've ever known. Higher education played a huge role in terms of social and economic mobility for people like me. And it was an important avenue because, think about it, we got single-payer healthcare in 1966. We got a dramatic expansion in the Canadian version of the welfare state in the mid-1960s to the early 1970s. This required people who had general and specific intellectual skills and knowledge. In addition to that, in the private sector, the bureaucratization of corporations, requiring people who knew how to communicate, knew how to write, knew how to do accounting, knew how to do economics, all kinds of things, created a demand for people with an education. So there was a huge demand for that. 1990s, and I should say, at an ideological level, a cultural level, political level, higher education was viewed to be a collective benefit, a public good. So we jump forward to the mid-1990s, the Common Sense Revolution, and a reconceptual, I worked, none of you would know this, well, I'll punch in with, I worked in the Department of Labor in the 1990s, in part during the first term of the Mike Harris government. A real reconceptualization of higher education, from that public good to a private good. Therefore, why should the public pay for private benefit? And this is very much a part of the thinking at that time. I was at the Department of Labor. I did not work in ministry colleges and universities, but this was a fundamental shift, a hugely fundamental shift. And, you know, going back to, you know, that period where the Cold War and the boogeyman of the Soviet Union drove a huge amount of investment into higher education, science and technology in particular, and engineering. That was really significant. But today, you know, jumping forward, where have we arrived at from that, you know, so-called golden age, which was not a golden age, but, you know, it was what it was. Where are we now today? In terms of overall per capita funding, Ontario ranks 10 out of 10. In terms of per student funding, Ontario ranks 9 out of 10. I think I might be incorrect, but I believe only Alberta falls below Ontario in terms of per capita funding, per student, I should say. So that ideological reframing is very much a function of the Thatcherite revolution in Britain. I wrote my PhD dissertation essentially on the common sense revolution. And I interviewed a number of people who were part of writing the Common Sense Revolution Manifesto. A few of the names I do remember: Leslie Noble, Guy Giorno, a few others I forget. But they were very much involved in attending Republican Party workshops. Leslie, I remember her telling me she went to the UK and attended Conservative Party educationals, that kind of thing. And there were some funny stories I'm not going to share here, but they were kind of like, wow, it's a totally different thing, and you had no idea, did you? No, did not. But what happened in the UK has now resulted in a situation where 1/3 of British universities, I should say English, not Scottish, English, specifically English, are on the verge of bankruptcy. The elite universities, Cambridge, Oxford, etc., are doing incredibly well. You've got this incredible polarization happening in higher education, which is what's going to happen here in Ontario. That's very much on the agenda, where non-elite universities like the one I'm at are going to be under huge stress. Not every program. Some programs are incredibly in demand. Others, humanities, are dying everywhere. They're wonderful. I mean, they're the humanities. How can you not have them? They're increasingly approaching the point of departure. And this is happening in the UK. I mean, a funny little anecdote. I read an interview in The Guardian with Patrick Stewart 4 or 5 years ago. And you know Patrick Stewart, the actor. He plays Captain Jean-Luc Picard in Star Trek Next Generation. He grew up in a very working class family in a council house, and he could only study drama. I forget where he studied drama, but he could only do it because the British government paid for it. And then during the Thatcherite revolution, counter-revolution, that all kind of evaporated. And he said, there'll never be another one like me, where you are a working class person and you want to study drama, and the state would pay much of it. And he just said, I'm the end of the line. And then he compared himself to, what's his name, Cumberbatch, who comes from a very posh background. He said, like, yeah, it's going to be people like that. Anyway, that's it. So, in terms of the Ford government, what they're actually doing, okay, there are a handful of things. The neoliberal playbook in anything is about centralization and opacity, like shutting off the lights. Nobody can know. So, the two key things that have come forward from the Ford government recently, very recently, notwithstanding all the budget cuts or freezing, which had long-term impact, but the agreements, what are they called? The SMAs, the sectoral what do they call SMA, strategic management agreements between the Ministry of Colleges and Universities and the Government of Ontario. They've been in place since the McGuinty government, but they've become very, very granular. And what they're about now with the Ford government, next year, 40% of all operational grants are going to be based on how well you perform on very particular metrics. There are 8 metrics in total, half of which universities have virtually no control over. But it's going to be 40% of funding. So you can imagine how these strategic management agreements are going to be used to guide universities to go in particular directions. And why do they matter? Okay, I'm jumping over a few things here for time, but here are a few of the metrics over which, how do we have any control over? 1, the graduate employment rate in a related field. A related field. How do you define related field? I don't know. That would be one of them. Graduate employment earnings. How do we have any control over that in any way? A third one, which is quite interesting in terms of privatization and the invasion of private sector for-profit interests into the university, attracting private sector investment. What does that mean? It means commercialization. It means leading toward commercialization. And again, how do we, depending on your field, like in my field, well, what does that mean, actually? We don't really have engineering, yes. Business, maybe yes. Some parts of computer science, maybe yes. STEM, there are parts of STEM, maybe. Not everything. But again, it's all very oriented toward commercialization, right? Can money be made? It's not like, the old-fashioned, we're going to do research for the sake of research, and where we end up, we end up. It's not going to be that. It's very, very targeted, very focused. And the final point I will make, which is very obscure, most people will have never heard of it, an arm's length entity called the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario. They do really, really good, problematic, but good, data analytical work. And they're arm's length. They're not part of the government, not directly. With the budget that went by a month ago, or 2 months ago, March, it's now been internalized into the Ministry of Colleges and Universities. It's no longer arm's length. That data analytical work, that collection of data, will only feed what we would call, when I was in the government, feeding the machine. This data, this information will now inform critical decision-making within the government of Ontario. And that's not unimportant, believe me. When I look back on my time in government, this kind of data, which we will not have access to anymore, because don't forget, freedom of information is gone. It's gone. Will be very, very strategic about how the Government of Ontario, the Ministry of Colleges and Universities, begin looking at each institution. What are people enrolling in? What are they doing? What are the outcomes? And it will become weaponized. That data will become weaponized. ECHO did not weaponize it. They put it out there, but they did not weaponize it. It will now be strategically employed. Anyway, that's my opinion.
Thank you for the speech. That was wonderful. And thank you for having me on the panel on such short notice. I will also try to keep it timely. So my name is Maddy. I'll be speaking about the student perspective. Like Jordan said, I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Toronto, and I've been very involved in the past few months, ever since the OSAP cuts in March, organizing with our group called Ontario Students Against Austerity, that you can see our beautiful banner in the back. And I'll be talking today a little bit about the background of the OSAP cuts, and then giving an overview of the current state of the student movement, the student fight back, and how, as Ontario Students Against Austerity, we want to intervene in the student movement. So just some background. OSAP is a government-funded grants and loans program that you've probably heard of. It helps a lot of students get through college, get through university, and fund their higher education. Under Doug Ford, starting next semester, students who are under OSAP will not only have their tuition increased, but the original program, which was originally 85% grants and 15% loans, is being cut to mostly loans. So these OSAP cuts also have a precedent in Ontario. We can look at things like the Student Choice Initiative, which was attacking student unions by allowing students to opt out of the student unions and basically cutting the funding from the student unions. We can look at the 2019 OSAP cuts and then the college cuts last summer. And we at Students Against Austerity, we understand that these cuts to higher education take place within a larger austerity crisis, a larger crisis in our economic system. We understand austerity to be when capitalism, it has a falling rate of profit, and so the capitalist class, these people who privatize these public services, want quick ways to make profit, and one of those ways is, of course, privatization, basically looting our public services. Like Bryan said, in the Thatcherite Revolution, that was a very good example of austerity. And as well, we see this in connection to imperialism, where it is basically this looting of public services and resources, but abroad. And we also understand that this is basically a wealth transfer. So last summer, OPSU did some incredible research about what was going on in the college cuts, and it basically exposed how, whereas support staff, teachers were getting their budget cut, administration and other profiteers were getting their salaries increased. So we can see that it's fundamentally an issue of class stratification and class struggle. After Doug Ford's announcement, CFS Ontario, which is the Canadian Federation of Students, a federation that represents 35 Federation member local student unions and over 350,000 full-time and part-time students, so one of the biggest federation for student unions in Ontario, along with USA and CASA. They announced a series of protests and demonstrations. So you might have heard about the one at March 4th at Queen's Park or on March 24th. But they have not gone the further step of trying to actually organize like a student strike. At the same time, many spontaneous student initiatives have popped up. So things like Ontario Protest, walkouts for OSAP, which basically took the route of trying to demonstrate against these OSAP cuts. So from our perspective, we basically see three routes right now that students are taking to combat the OSAP cuts. So we have the CFS route of lobbying, petitioning, voting, and then we have the spontaneous route of student protests, demonstrations, walkouts, and the route and tactic that we are obviously partisan for is the tactic of the student strike. And obviously, since we are trying to organize a student strike, we think that the latter has an edge over the first two. We think that it's the only plan that has leverage behind it, that doesn't just appeal to the moral conscience of our legislators or the moral conscience of people in power, nor does it bank on voting in 2030 when most of the students who are actually affected by the OSAP cuts right now, who are outraged, are going to be graduating. And as we've seen, the CFS kind of route has kind of died down. Ontario Protest and the spontaneous protests that we saw organized have also not really gained traction. So we think that the only plan for here and now is to organize a student strike. And as you heard in the last speech, as Bryan mentioned, Ontario has one of the lowest per student fundings out of all of the provinces in Canada, whereas Quebec has one of the highest. And we think that there's a reason for that, right? Quebec has an actual history of using the student strike tactic and actually mobilizing students to fight against tuition increases and other sorts of austerity measures, like they did in 2012 in Quebec. And that's actually why they have the wins that they do. These wins did not come from nowhere. They came from a history of actually mobilizing students through material means and tactics. So that brings us to our organization. It's called Students Against Austerity. We're a grassroots network of students that popped up after the OSAP cuts. Right now we're at a few campuses across Ontario, so OCAD, Guelph, York, TMU, UFT, and McMaster. Our goal is to reverse the OSAP cuts and create a broader anti-austerity coalition, and currently we are organizing a student strike. We're non-sectarian, we're non-partisan, and we want independent power for students, so we don't try to funnel students into voting for any particular party or joining any particular sect. We're an open tendency group that anybody who wants to organize for a student strike can work with. So far in our organizing, we've taken a two-tiered approach to organizing the student strike. You might have seen this, you might have not. It was pretty viral on Instagram, but we got strike policy motions passed at McMaster and at OCAD that allow for a strike policy to be built, where we can set up basically strike assemblies that will represent students during the strike. And then we'll be working on trying to get a strike mandate closer to our strike deadline, which across our campuses we've decided to be in the fall semester in the week of November 9. As well, we're organizing something called the Trillium Coalition, which unites students, organized labor, and tenants groups, and it brings together all groups that are affected currently, mostly by austerity. And as for our projected strike timeline, we want a strike in November 9th of this year, and then we're also planning a cross-provincial strike in March, which will have folks in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Quebec, etc., actually all striking during the same week next year. And finally, on a national timeline, and maybe this strike plan is the most pertinent to our discussion today, we actually want to align our student strike organizing with the general strike that was called by the United Auto Workers in 2028. So that was for May Day in 2028. And the United Auto Workers has basically called for a general strike where it encourages unions to align contract expirations as close as possible to April 30th. So that covers like our strike plans. I guess maybe a few closing remarks. I think from the student perspective, the most important thing for us right now is to learn from the experiences of labor and other folks on the panel today to actually find a winning strategy to mobilize folks to actually fight austerity and reverse the austerity measures that are affecting all of us today. So, thank you.
My name is Sam. Out of my depth on this panel here, because I largely work with comrades across the city who are doing a lot of ground-based organizing, primarily against big tech capital, Uber, Amazon, and we're moving workers into, ideally for unionization. Why not go after the biggest ones? But I think part of this is, and not to do a shameless plug on it, was around an article that me and a professor comrade from York wrote around the international student crisis. And I think it's important from what you were saying as well as yourself, not to sound patronizing because I know we all know this, but it's a helpful and healthy reminder, as we often say, that history didn't start on October 7th in 2023, yeah? But these crises are not something that immediately happens or manufactured. We don't look at, like we do look at the opioid crisis and say, oh shit, we're in a crisis, not and dismiss the fact that all these pharmaceutical companies have been pushing, especially onto working class populations, their drugs. And that linkage, that lineage, that history is an important assessment on what to do currently, but also where the trends are all going. And so this international student crisis that people keep on talking about, like somehow this was some sort of new thing that we just finally noticed, has been going on for decades. Largely starting in 1996 with the Harris cuts, that universities needed money. And so who's best to do it? Bring in money from overseas. And I think that there's an important element right now in why it connects to Uber, why it connects to Amazon, why it connects to employment and labor struggles that big labor is now starting to take on, but people have been on this work for a while, is we're seeing this anti-immigration sentiment that is rising across the country. was in Newfoundland about 7-8 months ago in some small town having a beer at a bar, and I'm not saying this was just white racist dudes, I'm saying this was white nationalists. It was organized white nationalists, and it was the first time I've ever run into something like that. I traveled extensively across the country. So this is, and what they were talking about was the international student crisis. Assuming, yeah. And so it is a scary time around those things, and this manufactured crisis is now being shifted over again. There were 7,000 articles from last year talking about the international student crisis in the mainstream media. And the progressive discourse around that has often been status for all. We need to talk about this. It's been around racial equity, and it's important, no denying that. But this has been fundamentally a labor crisis that's been manufactured. And where it's been manufactured through is a state needed cheap labor. And constantly, as a society, we have a level of collective amnesia, yeah, in the COVID pandemic, we were looking at international students saying, these are thank God for them. Yeah, we were looking at them as saying essential labor, like healthcare workers. My dudes on the bikes were seen as relevant to society as nurses were. And that shift had happened right in front of us. And I think there's a need to understand like a transnational and transhistorical assessment of this. Sorry, I'm just running through a bunch of things on it, but one of those things with it is that in the 90s, when this cuts happened, you brought in a law, and Canada was very open about this. They recruited international students across the third world, global south, but it wasn't recruiting individuals who were working class in India or Bangladesh or Nepal. It was recruiting rich people. And it paid the bills for places like York. It's 70-30 split, and a large chunk of that money that York is getting is from international students. But there was a shift that happened in the 2000s, especially in the late 2000s. And in 2012, the government releases a report and says, you know what, we need to double, for the universities, we need to double international students. So we went from just in a single year from about 250,000 to about 500,000. And now we're talking about, in the last 5 years, 1.3 million international students have been brought over to the country. Not all of them are rich, and we all know it, yeah? And what has happened, and the Pandora's box is opened, when big institutions like York or UFT start to do this process of this is good, vital money for us to counteract these cuts, smaller institutions started doing it as well. I was in Regina a few years ago, and there was tons of brown people there. I'm like, it was a small town outside of Regina. I was like, where the hell did you all come from? And I was talking to a labor organizer there, and she's like, I'm just as confused, but there's these small colleges in strip malls opening up. Yeah, and you talk to the drivers on Uber, you talk to Tim Hortons workers, you talk to Amazon workers. Many of them came here as international students. And this crisis has been manipulated, it has been brought through by the government, by capital, and by institutions. And with this Pandora's box, what we're now seeing is tons of, on two fronts of it. On the racial equity side, we're seeing tons and tons of people who are terrified. How you're taking a 17-year-old from Bangladesh who's working class, and 7 years ago you're telling them that they are essential labor. And today, you're spitting in their face and saying you need to go back where you came from. And that is fucked up for anybody, but for a 17-year-old, who's now 27 and saying, what do I do? Today, there's a Lotus Funeral Home in Mississauga. They're saying 7 to 10 bodies are sending back to India, just India, of suicides. And so we needed cheap labor, so we brought it in. And we do this, this is the Western model. We do this, and now there's a question of what do we do with that? And the problem with the international student crisis and calling it an international student issue is that this is a labor issue. You brought in students rather than what we've often done in this country, which is migrant labor. It's a temporary foreign workers program. It's what we see on farms throughout wine country. Rather than doing that, there was an easier way to triple it. Housing made money. I've been a housing organizer for a long time as well, but housing made money. Institutions like York made money, and capital made money. And right now, organizing just got out of a meeting earlier today and yesterday with Uber drivers, and I think it's a relevant point of how we've gotten here. All of them came here as international students. None of them stayed as international students, though. There was a significant amount of dropout rates because these colleges were starting to shut down. They were paying upwards of $30,000 to $40,000 just to get here. And they're all working class from whatever country that they're coming from. And what they keep on talking about is this is not, like, we just need to get out. There's no jobs in India, there's no jobs in Bangladesh. We know the international crisis that's happening. And where the relevancy comes from is they're not students, they're workers. It's a labor fight. But the link does directly happen into these higher educations. That's where the crisis started. And we could put this on the government, and we should put this on the government. But these institutions did make a shit ton of money. York now has a new medical school. Where does that money come from? And so I think this has been our thought process while we're organizing. There's maybe and why I think this becomes relevant for the labor struggles ahead, why we're looking at it, and this is not a blame thing. Yeah, my politics is on the left for a reason, but there is a downpression of wages that is happening. We cannot lie about it. When you bring in 1.3 million people, you know what you're doing, and you're like cheap labor, it is a downpression of wages. Amazon workers, which are largely racialized out in the East End, there's a significant anger towards international students. So without taking on this from both a higher education perspective and a labor perspective, this crisis is going to get worse and worse. People are going to keep on coming. I was with a comrade yesterday who was, and maybe some of you who might remember this from the 90s, of the anti-racist action. Yeah. And there's a realness to it, yeah, with the rise of white nationalism and where it's all going to lead. And our job is not to just analyze the past, it's also to plan for the future. And one of the things the comrade was saying was, anti-racist action, there was a rise of white nationalists. They had their bunker down the street from here. In St. Jamestown. And 2 people died. Yeah, I'm Tamil as well. 2 people died. It was 2 Tamil workers who were going home after an ARA concert, and they curb stopped them. Yeah, and there was, and the amusing part about it is, because I was talking to my pops about this, yeah, he's like, I was terrified. I was terrified for you, I was terrified for us, came here as a refugee. And the amusing part about it for me is that we were cheap labor. There's 350,000 that they brought. So we know where the trends are going. And until we look at this from a perspective of how do we organize as much as possible, what are the direct entry points into higher ed and labor, and all the things that we have to do with it, the crisis is going to get worse. That is it on my part, but yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam, and to all 3 of you. Okay, so I've been participating in these working group meetings since they started in November, and in my spiel I'm just going to give a bit of a recap of what we've been talking about, and I'm going to do that sort of with an orientation towards a sort of discussion of where we can go next, right? I think that in a nutshell there are 2 sort of organizing streams that we've been discussing. One of them is what I'm going to call the workplace coalition idea. This is the idea that the labor movement builds coalitions at the campus level. So if you have multiple bargaining units who are able to go on strike at the same time, then or whose contracts expire at the same time, then they bargain together, right? They insist that their comrade workers get a good deal, and that's part of the condition of them signing a collective agreement. The second sort of general stream that we've been talking about is the idea of like a province-wide coalition movement where we start to address the serious structural problems that we've all been talking about here, which is the severe underfunding of post-secondary education. So my main point here is that I think that this working group and this project in general should invest in the first one, in some orientation towards a workplace coalition building. And at a minimum, I think to build some sort of institutional capacity that would actually remain and not fizzle out, I think that we should be thinking about creating at least one part-time position, whether it's funded through the Socialist Project or the Leo Panish School, or whether it's or whether it's organized. Otherwise, we can talk about that later. But I think that's what it would need to gain some sort of foothold. But I think at the same time, we all clearly agree that the workplace coalition strategy is not enough, right? We're talking about something that's much bigger. We're talking about a province level, even a country level issue, a serious deficit in the financing, in the public financing of post-secondary education. So that would require a form of province-wide coalition that would be substantially more ambitious, and it would take and it would be more of a long-term process as well. So I'm going to start by quickly recapping 4 of the contributions related to workplace coalitions that we've touched on since we started meeting in November. There was one really interesting presentation that we heard from a guy named Sean Smith, who helped organize the QP and CAW workers into the coalition that became the Toronto Airport Workers Council. That happened quite a while ago, and Sean's been organizing at the airport for quite some time. He also had a lot of interesting things to say about how to mobilize non-workers and like community members into campaigns so that the message extends into the broader public and goes well beyond the workplace. In our first meeting, we heard from Jordan and his colleague Paul Gray. They presented a paper of theirs which is about the coalition of Rutgers unions in New Jersey. They led a successful strike of 3 unions at the same time in 2023. All of those unions made substantial gains. They were all, their collective agreements were substantially strengthened, I think it's fair to say, by the coalition organizing that they did there. Their paper also does a great job, I think, of demonstrating that this isn't just like a silver bullet. It's not easy to organize workplace coalitions. There are problems that arise and tensions that arise between the different bargaining units. Not all of the bargaining units actually even joined the CRU. One of the bargaining units left when it felt kind of betrayed that another one had like signed a concessionary agreement on its own, and then additionally, many of the bargaining units have to contend with political interference by their parent unions, right? So all these problems come to play. It's not, it's by no means an easy thing to do, right? Plus, there's like the question of how these unions relate to the faculty associations and so on. But in any case, it can be done and it can work. We can make gains. A third contribution that has come in through our meetings was from Luke Decord and Claudia, who are both at U of T. And they talked about their experience of organizing a similar coalition last year, which brought in, maybe you can, two, right? So there's 2 bargaining units that threatened to go on strike together. They bargained together, and as soon as the administration realized that they were serious about this, they were willing to take the risk, they started to make substantial gains, and I think it's fair to read that as a substantial success story. And some real capacity to start to be built there at U of T, which I think is exciting. Something similar, I'll add sort of parenthetically, something similar has been going on at Queen's University in Kingston. The Queen's Unity Council has brought 9 different bargaining units together, 5 of which made gains under their new collective agreements last year, when they, as a result of their coordination. Finally, a fourth sort of interesting contribution that I'll mention also was put together by Jordan, maybe some other people who, which is just a spreadsheet, and it's titled the Collective Agreement Tracker. It shows all of the collective agreements and their expiry dates at all the universities pretty much across Ontario, right? This is I think a great organizing tool. If we pursue this route, we can just take a look at, what's going on, what's on the horizon, where should we be focusing our attentions, right? So the main point here is that we have built up some knowledge within this working group, and I think when we put it together, it's pretty easy for me to imagine that we could promote the workplace coalition further. So as I said, we could look into starting a part-time position within the SP, potentially by garnering some additional contributions from the unions that are already funding the SP's activities, and then it's also possible that with union buy-in we could have this position be organized under the Ontario Universities and Colleges Coalition, or the OUCC, which already brings a bunch of them together. And I'll talk about them further below. So ideally, it would be somebody with experience in the labor movement. They would be sort of checking the collective agreement tracker continually, saying like, okay, we've got 3 collective agreements coming up for expiry in Ag 12. Let me reach out to those different bargaining units and their leaders, see if they're interested in doing some sort of coalition work, helping them to coordinate it, helping them to overcome the obstacles, and then putting them in touch with people like Claudia, maybe if she's into it, or Luke, or the people at Queen's, people who have like experience doing this, you know, and then sort of trying to build it, right? That in itself, I think, could help workers make gains at the campus level, but it would also foster stronger connections between the different unions, right? Okay, so to me, this seems like a fairly natural way to build on what we've already established so far in the working group. But as I said, the problem is that this doesn't probably address the root problems that we're facing, which, you know, my co-panelists have already discussed. Ontario really does have a dramatically low level of public funding per student. It's like half of the Canadian average, right? It's so pitiful, and it's like it should really come as no surprise that we're facing this kind of crisis, right? Not only that, but the outlook is quite bad because the Ford government is obsessed with balancing its budget 2 years from now. That means that in 2027-28, the post-secondary funding will go down from its current level of $14 billion to $12.8 billion. So that will further open up this hole in the post-secondary budgets. So I'm going to talk about like my read. I think we're all basically in agreement about what's been going on here. I would add that it's not just a crisis of post-secondary funding that we've been facing, but in the past couple of years, I think we've seen that crisis or that policy failure collide with another policy failure, which has been in the housing market, right? And that also dates back more or less to the 90s. We've seen the government obsessively inflate the property market across Canada as part of a very short-term growth strategy. That became accentuated during the pandemic, and then when the pandemic eased up, Canada said, okay, like the Trudeau government said, okay, all these small business people are clamoring for more laborers, we're gonna let in more than ever before. They did that, and then everyone is freaking out and scapegoating foreign students for the housing crisis. I cannot emphasize enough that there is zero evidence that international students have anything to do with the housing crisis or property inflation in Canada. It doesn't exist. It's a complete fiction. But the Trudeau government, who has no spine or no idea what they're doing, just fed into this scapegoating, said, oh my God, sorry, forget it. We actually hate international students, and then drastically reduced the number of foreign student permits that they were issuing in 2024. That had this obvious knock-on effect in the post-secondary sector, which had become which had become increasingly reliant on foreign student tuition, as you said. So to me, when we look at it from that perspective, there's actually a sort of, we're suddenly looking at it from a different perspective than the campus level. We're looking at a situation where universities are also quite peeved about the level of financial precarity that they've experienced as a result of these funding cuts from the province. I think that in a certain universe, there's a possibility for this movement and the labor movement in general to work in certain ways with universities, university administrations, to petition the provincial government for an enhancement or a revival of public funding in the sector. What would it take to do that? I think it would take, I agree with Maddy that it would take a lot more than moral suasion. It would take, I think, quite a bit of like forceful action. The kind of organization that I envision being capable of that is one that would bring together multiple unions across Ontario, as well as students and potentially other stakeholders. There is already an organization that does that, which I mentioned briefly up top, the OUCC, the University and the Ontario University and Colleges Coalition. I guess I'm basically out of time, but but essentially this, I'll just do this in 15 seconds. This organization exists, but it has no staff and it has no funding, and it's basically just a roundtable where these different groups, including QP, CFS Ontario, OQFA, OPSU, OSSTF, PSAC, they get together once every quarter. They have lunch for an hour and they just sort of check in with each other. In the past couple of days, I've talked to 3 people who have been attending these meetings at the OUCC, and all of them are interested in doing more, in building it into something that's bigger, more robust, and more aggressive. So if we want to take it to that level, then I think that this is a pathway that we should seriously consider. It will involve sort of strengthening our ties with the member organizations first, but that's the general idea that I wanted to lay out.
Okay, so we've got about 25 minutes for Q&A, but before we do that, I just want to announce an upcoming training that the Higher Education Labor Working Group is putting on. A 2-day intensive how to organize at work, worker organizer training. The dates are August 22nd and 23rd. You can register via the QR code. Also, if you're interested in just staying in touch with us, this campaign work, any of these people, you can see our campaign email address there, highered@socialistproject.ca. So, with that said, turn it over to audience questions, comments.
In terms of the party influence on policy, again, I spent a decade in government working in a policy position, and I worked for a political party at the legislature before that in opposition. So your point is really correct, but how do you get the attention of a party? And in our current location, there's only one party that might pay attention, right? It's the Social Democrats, the NDP. And the degree to which they have to calculate, they can't do everything. Like the one thing about any political party, whatever they are, they make calculations about, we can't do 44 things, we can do 5. And how do you become one of the 5 items on the agenda? That becomes part of the issue. And if you're not in government, or not in a position to influence government, i.e. in our case, minority government, you're shit out of luck, right? There's not much you can do because you're easily ignored. When I worked in the labor ministry during the Harris government, which is it's why I left, how I became an academic actually, because I had to get out of town. They just did not want to hear it. Like there were a variety of issues on any given topic they were not interested in. In fact, we were prohibited from speaking to unions. It was a fatwa. You could not do it. People did it under the radar anyway, but it was all done very, very quietly. So it becomes a matter of, to what degree when people in a major political party, I'm not talking a minor party on the fringe, a parliamentary party, to what degree is the issue something they want to carry forward and they think will be electorally viable? And that becomes the issue, right? Is it electorally viable? It's an ugly calculation, but it is the calculation.
My experience of working actively in the labor movement is so limited. But one thing I've been thinking about a lot, as I'm sure has everyone in this room, is how genuinely difficult it is to build power from the bottom up, right? Like, there's this kind of, like, there's this romantic sense in like, the canonical labor movement and, you know, in the Marxist literature and all this stuff, like, workers have the true power, right? And it's like, I don't know, do they? Like, to actually win policy changes and work with the level of coordination that is required to do that is mammoth, and it's like and power dynamics between government and citizens vacillate over time. Power dynamics between elites and non-elites vacillate over time, and maybe this isn't answering your question, so I apologize. But you know, I have felt strongly, like, in the movement for justice in Palestine, we have been doing like almost everything that is within our capacity. I think that we've been doing so much, right? And we have not made the kinds of gains that, you know, that one would expect, or that like liberal pluralist theory, you know, that we all learned in undergrad would predict, right? That has been like, this has been the opposite of the case. But in this sector, I think like one of the things that, one of the messages that came out of my conversations with all these people who have been involved with the OUCC is that we can be doing so much more. Like, there's an opportunity to do way more when it comes to both of the strategies that I talked about, the workplace coalitions and province-wide coalitions. Like, there is much more that could be done in terms of coordination. I think that in order to get union executives to even be willing to do that, we would have to work quite a bit with rank and file members who would have to present a coherent and persuasive vision.
Of the question of labor, workers, students. I was at a comrade's birthday party yesterday, and I think this is where the importance of it comes from. A comrade's birthday party yesterday, and as at any good Toronto party, all the Scarborough people will always find each other, and so we did, and didn't know each other, but we were talking, and everybody's in their 30s into their 40s now. We were talking about high school, as you often do. And one of the things that really caught me off guard with it, and I've been thinking about this for years, and it was so interesting to hear random people that I've never met say the same thing. In the 90s, when the Harris cuts happened, there was a second thing that happened with it. It was the applied and academic streams, if people do remember this. And what it was if at 12, when you're moving from middle school to high school, you get to pick which stream you go to. I was put into the applied stream. And what it does, it shuts the door for higher education. Who did it do it to? Working class and racialized kids. And then they needed money again. So this stream was, and they're like, this is racist. Toronto Star wrote a huge article about this, like, this is racist and it's classist. But effectively, you needed cheap labor here. Working class kids are your best bet for it. This policy shifted, but maybe the only time it's been ever relevant, I work at York. I work with students at York, and I've been in and out of York and didn't finish at York because of these OSAP cuts that happened a number of years ago before this. And York is a working class school. Median income is lower than most other schools. First time university for undergraduate students and their families. All this is real. And the importance of the stream thing is that this shit is actually affecting the working class as a whole. The OSAP cuts means that working class kids don't have access to what middle class and upper middle class kids do. That across Scarborough, across North York, or in Jane and Finch, young kids, because you see it on Reddit, are talking about, I can't go there. And it's great right now. If we pushed out the international students, now you have a different cheap workforce. Yeah, let's not pretend about it. And so it is not and there's a second thing, because I work at York, and TAs are a bit more astute to this than the professors are, but professors have talked to me about this. Kids are falling asleep in their classes. Yeah? And they're like, why the fuck is this happening? Because you're working 8 to 10 hours. We're not, CUPW did this a number of years ago, yeah? They wanted to recruit salts for the Amazon plant. So they went to York, and that's how some of the comrades got involved. And they're like, come salt. They don't have to recruit salts at York anymore. They work on Amazon factory floors. And who are these? These are working class kids. It's a labor issue and a higher education issue. And there's a secondary point, and that's what I think when we miss it, when we pigeonhole and we side it low, and we look at higher education as some sort of great force, not the neoliberal institution that it is. Yeah, and there's a second thing. There's a comrade called me. She's a professor at York. She's doing a visiting prof in India, in South India right now. And South India is, because for a variety of reasons, has a very robust public universities. Yeah, working class kids, working class kids, farmers, they have access to higher education in a way that we don't have it here since the 1960s. But they have an easy access to. York is doing this because she told me that Rhonda Lenton, the president of York, and she's like, you might want to know this, called me to a meeting, said nothing about what the meeting was, and for an hour and change, her and senior leadership was, because she's a visiting prof there, was like, can you talk to the university that you're at, both in India and in Vietnam? They're setting up, and TMU's already doing this, UFT's been doing this, they're setting up a program right now that you get a York degree from India, 3 years there, 1 year here. If you can't bring them here for 4 years, you might as well go there. And the fear that's setting through a lot of comrades in India right now is the access that they had fought and won for. The fuckers here are fucking them over. Yeah, so we can talk about the cuts that the Harris government got. York University has already figured out, TMU's already figured out a new stream of income. Let's fuck over the global south, as it always happens. And I think that is the element of it. It is a student issue, because it is a working class issue. And I think in higher education, we often forget that perspective. That it was never meant for working class kids. We finally figured out a way to get in, and now we're getting fucked again.
Yeah, so I'll just be addressing Brent's question. I think it's interesting. So he asked that, can an electoral, I assume, party help? And it's interesting because SAA as an organization, we are explicitly nonpartisan, and I will explain why. In our analysis, we think that in order for politicians to actually listen to you, and even to hold them accountable, you need some sort of leverage. I'm going to echo my fellow co-panelist's point that frankly, people in government, they don't really have an incentive to listen to you unless it's like around election time, right? Unless you can vote for them. So for us, we think that our focus should be building independent power for students so that they actually do have leverage to maybe eventually make electoral politicians listen to them. And I think this gets to a question of, can there be a politics outside of simply policy? Which is kind of a comment that Brent made. In our opinion, I think oftentimes when we speak of policy, we kind of speak from the subjective position of like a policy wonk. How can we implement this ideal blueprint for policy? But it kind of puts the cart before the horse because it assumes that you're already in the position of a legislator, of a policymaker, when actually achieving political power, you haven't answered that question yet. You haven't gotten to that point yet. So for us at SAA, we think that we need to first have some sort of political power, some sort of leverage, some sort of collective body before we start talking about policies. So thank you for your question. I thought that was a very interesting one. And maybe to address another question, it was about the connection between international students and labor. I just wanted to add a comment, which I think would be enlightening for people in this room. It's the idea that bringing international students in as basically a reserve army of labor, of surplus laborers, was a strategy that was very intentional and was planned at least 10 years ago. So in the OPSU report, they cited a plan from 2014 called the Internal Education Strategy, which basically admitted that they wanted to bring in international students to address quote-unquote worker shortages, which for us, we know that that just means they want surplus workers to depress the wages, as my co-panelist said. So it's always been a very calculated class strategy from the beginning on the part of capital against workers and against international students who are being exploited. So those are just my 2 comments. Thank you for your questions.
I'm going to use my chair's prerogative to say a couple things in response to these questions. On the Adam's question of how do you basically approach the labor movement in terms of organizing? Do you talk to executives or do you talk to workers? I mean, without repeating too much of what Niko said, I mean, our meetings, this higher education labor working group it's a mix of rank and file workers and executive members who are sympathetic. I think what we're trying to do, like Niko was saying, is develop a shared analysis and understanding about what needs to be done and a plan for how to do it, and to get buy-in from friendly, existing, elected executive members in their unions to take on this work and to do the education and organizing work amongst their own membership that's needed. And then also on the other hand, to build up rank and file bottom-up pressure in other places where executives of whatever unions might be less friendly. And so it's a kind of both approach. On the student labor link, I want to shout out the work of the Nithiananthan Support Network, who we asked to be here today. They couldn't make it. But if people don't know, they are a Brampton-based organization, primarily Punjabi. They have taken on an incredible anti-wage theft campaign. They have won back about $1 million of stolen wages, primarily food and retail workers, transportation, trucking, in about a 5-year campaign. And through that work, they developed relationships and recruited as members many of the people that Sam's been talking about, people here on postgraduate work permits. And when the postgraduate work permit reforms were announced, whatever that was, a few years ago, basically moved the goalposts on people who had done everything they were supposed to do in order to become eligible for PR. All of a sudden they're facing potential deportation. They launched a campaign, a postgraduate worker committee formed of the Nithiananthan Support Network. They had an encampment out in Brampton. They're continuing to do this work. But if you're not familiar with them, you should look into their work. A very impressive organization. And I think what I just described shows this natural link. By approaching people as workers in shitty jobs, being taken advantage of by asshole bosses, the issues that emerge out of that turned into these immigration and student issues. And I think we can see other ways that these things are all interconnected. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 other questions, if there are any.
We envision the limited strike in November to only be an academic boycott, so just not attending classes. And it's more of a test run of our capacity to actually coordinate a provincial strike. But I will say it is quite different from simply like a one-day walkout, where you're correct, there isn't much pressure on the administration. They can just ignore it and be like, well, hopefully this ends. We view it as basically a threat to the administration and government that if we are not brought to the negotiating table this time around, we will stage an unlimited strike in the future. And that's where we actually have far more leverage, where we can do things like withholding tuition, or as well, what happened in 2012 in Quebec, creating this like social crisis that was eventually able to force the government to the negotiating table. And in the type of social crisis that happened in Quebec, the student movement brought forward all layers of society. So workers, parents, a lot of different stakeholders and different groups with different forms of leverage were brought along with the student movement. And that is kind of our ideal vision for how we can force this government to the negotiating table and reverse these austerity measures. So that is kind of like our broader vision. And I'm going to address another question, if that's okay, and hopefully that answers your question. We can chat a little bit more later if you want to. I think there was a question in the back about whether this movement should be bottom-up. And it kind of touches on a question that another person had about the rank-and-file strategy. And I do agree there is sometimes a romanticism about the rank-and-file strategy. We do, on the other hand, also need organizers who are sympathetic to our cause, who can do it full-time and actually educate the rank-and-file, who sometimes do tend to be apathetic. And the strategy that I envision for that is something along the lines of what 20th century social democrats had. So they had the slogan of the merger formula. And the idea was that you bring socialist consciousness to the workers' movement. What you're trying to achieve is a unity of the two, which will require both. It will require rank and file members who form, as most organizers know, the actual masses, the actual workers and material leverage. And then it will also take people who are sympathetic within the unions, who can educate and actually organize people who do oftentimes have a false consciousness, who do oftentimes scapegoat immigrants, who believe in things like white nationalism. And for us, it's about more correctly articulating their grievances than white nationalists and other actors can. It's about actually explaining to them the root causes of their suffering and their struggle so that they aren't misled by white nationalists. So that is our perspective and what we're really trying to do with the workers and student movement. And I'll just pass this on now.
I fully agree with that, yeah. And maybe just to also just touch on what the comrade was saying, I was talking to the NSN comrades not long ago and on the brilliant organizing that they've been doing, but there's a secondary portion of how this all gets interconnected. For the GWP, workers talk about this, worker drivers talk about this. It's very weird because it sounds like red string on a corkboard, but it's not, because the government has a stream, so it's a point system to stay in Canada, to get your PR, as international students, and they constantly change it. They change the work that you're supposed to be doing or what you're studying for, and they change where you're living in order to facilitate this. For example, a number of years ago, PSWs was really needed. And so that was a faster stream to get into your PR pathway. Right now, it's if you speak French, so NSN comrades were saying everybody's learning French. It was just interesting to hear. But why it's connected is, comrade might know this as well, the cod fishery industry in Newfoundland was shut down. It was supposed to be for 2 years. It ended up being for almost 30. It just opened up again 2 years ago. One of the streams that can give you a permanent pathway to PR today is to go work in the fishing boats. Yeah, so you're moving, you're literally moving wherever you want, and that'll change again. And so New Brunswick just opened up a different stream where if you have French, the Irvings long dude just died, good shit. But yeah, there's needs for labor there, and so it is pulling people around the country, and that's also almost making difficult on certain organizing fronts that I think it's important to notice. But there is a legitimate thing, and this is to the brother in the question back of, I don't think we need liberal academics to tell us what to do. I think we have good ideas, we just don't have the ability to sit still long enough. But I think there's a secondary portion on the right of board. People waited 25 years for the cod fishery industry to open, and now there's no jobs again. Yeah, it's just a material reality that is being now facilitated, again, manufacturing crisis, facilitated by both the state and capital. And international students are the pawns in it, and so what's going to happen, I don't know, but it is, yeah, people want to stay, and people want jobs. So I think recognizing all of it from a working class perspective is the only thing that's going to be able to, that we can combat all of it together. But yeah, just thoughts on it.
Thanks. I will address the question at the back about the elite desire for public apathy. You're asking like a very high level and interesting question, and I guess like for somebody of my generation, you know, I was going to undergrad starting in 2006, right? And the consensus there was overwhelmingly liberal. Maybe it is still, I guess, probably in political science departments and whatnot. But we were still sort of using this theory from the middle of the 20th century that, okay, like, wow, we have made so much progress all of a sudden. There's been a huge level of democratization. Society is more equal now than it was in the mid-19th century. What is going on? All of this must be part of some deep, something deeply embedded in the DNA of capitalism that's leading to all of this progress, right? You know, now with 70 years of hindsight at our disposal, I think that we're seeing something quite different, which Bryan alluded to, which is that whole arrangement was deeply embedded in the politics of the Cold War, right? And also, you know, maybe in some of the dimensions of production that were specific to the mid-20th century and its form of industrialization, right? Since the Cold War ended, there has the Cold War really did incentivize elites, I think, to democratize in certain ways, to empower people in certain ways because they cared about education, they cared about like actually building a skilled workforce because there was so much fear about falling behind in terms of like the technological frontier and everything like that. Since that transition, the post-Cold War collapse, I think a lot of elites in both Western Europe and in North America just kind of stopped caring. Like that international drive was not there to build a highly skilled population. And yeah, so like I think we have sort of reverted more to this kind of like really revolting 19th century style sort of like sneering elitism where there is a high level of desire among elites and super elites for stupefaction and like illiteracy and democratic reversal, democratic backsliding or disenfranchisement. So that's, you know, that poses a lot of problems for us.
So, I'm going to cover 35 years in 45 seconds. Okay? So, to your question about the transition from the Common Sense Revolution to the McGuinty government, and I actually did study budgets. You know, like, given my job, I actually did study budgets. And the thing about Premier Dalton McGuinty and the people around him, prior to the election of 2003 when they took over, they were very much enamored with third way, the Tony Blair experiment. And part of that, and Dalton McGuinty himself, we have to remember his father was a literature prof at University of Ottawa, Dalton McGuinty Sr., who I actually knew. Very funny individual, different story. By funny, I mean humorous, right? Dalton McGuinty Jr. was enamored with the idea of human capital, which was embedded in the Blairite third way policy agenda, taking it away from other issues. The idea that creating a workforce of high value skills led to international competitiveness. And that was the route forward. Flawed, very flawed, but deeply informed. So what they did do, they appointed, you may remember, you may not, Bob Rae. Bob Rae was appointed to lead a commission in 2004. McGuinty comes in 2003, appoints Bob Rae to lead a review of higher education in Ontario in 2004, delivers recommendations in 2005. And when you boil it all down, it was essentially rolling back, not entirely, but to a large degree, the damage of the Common Sense Revolution. Not going forward, just kind of like covering that over. And so there was a reinvestment that did happen beginning around 2005. But the reinvestment was really about dealing with the damage that had been done, not going beyond that. So damage control, if you will. So there was a real change. And if you look at other areas other than social assistance, around education, healthcare spending, the McGuinty government did pump up public expenditure around all these programs, but again, only in terms of mitigating the damage that had been done. Not going beyond it, just like papering that over. And you know, don't forget, the McGuinty government was committed. They did not roll back the legislation that Harrison brought in around if they were going to increase taxes, there would have to be a referendum or something like that. They never rolled that back. They kept that. And were very, very conscientious about not increasing taxes in any kind of progressive way. And they had a little bit that they monkeyed around with on the margin, like the employer healthcare tax, that kind of thing. That was not trivial, but that was about it. You know, they didn't go beyond that. There was no, like the Bob Rae government had their Fair Tax Commission, did a whole like, volume like this thick on reviewing the entire tax regime. Of course they did nothing, you know, but they had a volume that thick. But the McGuinty government had no interest in opening up that issue. And then finally, very, very quickly on the previous question, there's a concept I became familiar with called agnotology, only a couple of years ago. And agnotology is a branch of sociology of knowledge, which is connected to the manufacturing of deliberate manufacturing of collective ignorance. And the Trilateral Commission, and the Business Council of Canada, the mainstream media. I mean, any of you watch morning television? Like, yeah? Do you realize how stupid it is? Like, they give you nothing. It's like profoundly stupid. And hundreds of thousands of people, maybe millions, I don't know. I watch it mainly because I'm trying to wake up. But it's like, oh my God. Like, they just talk about idiocy. There's nothing of value in any of that. And then if you go and read, you know, the mainstream media, which is different, how many people read anymore, I'm not sure. But there is this very real sociological, cultural situation we've arrived at where generally, collectively, and I'm not being a snob here, I'm not. We don't know what we don't know, right? And I think back, my maternal grandparents left Europe after World War I. They were both illiterate. They were politically active. And it's interesting, as a prof, and I watch people, I hand out degrees at, you know, whatever we call that thing, when people graduate, that ceremony. And you know, my grandparents, despite their illiteracy, were more politically informed than many of the people I give a political science degree to, you know? Because they had to learn. They were involved in the anti-war movement in World War I. My grandfather was a member of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, had to get the hell out of town, you know, in 1920 when they were declared illegal. But they knew, right? They knew. And paid attention to the degree that they could, even though they couldn't read. And then, now. I don't know.
Could we get a round of applause for our panelists, please? Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming out.